a story told from a girl's perspective. The road to Rilevo was not just a return, it was a plunge into the cold, merciless reality from which I had fled headlong 7 years ago. I was driving an old Lada, bought with my last money, and with every kilometer, the city noise was replaced by a deafening silence, and the asphalt gave way to a bumpy dirt road covered with crunchy snow. Endless fields floated past the window. Black, broken skeletons of forests, occasionally crooked huts with boarded-up windows. A dying village, the last refuge where someone was still waiting for me. At least I really hoped so. My parents had died long ago, and I had been raised by my grandmother Christina since childhood. She was a gloomy, strict, thin old woman, but she always loved her only granddaughter sincerely, and she was the only one who truly cared about me. For some reason, I thought about how I left here at 19 with a red diploma from a rural school, Akhmatova's house in a worn backpack, and the ironclad conviction that this hole would remain only a gloomy backdrop to my grandiose future successes. My head was full of unimaginable ambitions and expectations for life. The future then seemed like a shining ball full of possibilities. In reality, it was not at all kind to the young girl who ran away from her native village. Now that ball has burst, leaving only sticky, nasty shards in my palms. My husband's betrayal of my trust, his young mistress, endless court cases, our joint account emptied, and then dismissal from the job where I'd been considered, in quotation marks, irreplaceable, for 7 years. Everything I'd been so afraid of came crashing down like a rotten stump. Now there was only one thing left to do. Go back to where it all began. It was so humiliating. Ugh, I'm sure the locals will look at me with scorn and malice, especially my grandmother's neighbors. They'll say the city girl is back. And how much she bragged about moving to the city, that life there was completely different. She had her fun, tasted the bitter cup, and now she's come running back to hide under her grandmother's skirt. And I really did run back. Although that's a very strong word. More like crawled back, tail between my legs. Grandma Christina's hut stood on the edge of the forest. Small but sturdy. Built by her grandfather, a war veteran who died before his granddaughter was born, from centuries-old pine trees. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin, almost transparent stream. Grandma was saving firewood. I turned off the engine and sat for a few more minutes, looking at the house. It looked exactly the same. Carved window frames, blackened by time. A small porch, littered with chopped wood. And a strange, always alert look, as if the house was not sleeping but watching. The door opened by itself before I had time to drag myself and my heavy suitcase onto the low, completely worn steps. Inga, you're so slow. Why are you dawdling? Move faster, you'll freeze and catch a cold. A hoarse but firm voice came from the darkness of the porch. My grandmother, Christina Fedosevna, had hardly changed. She was still the same hunched but unbroken figure. She still had the same piercing gray eyes under thick, graying eyebrows. The same scarf, tightly tied around her small head. I remembered her exactly as she was when I last saw her, only the wrinkles had increased. They were now deeper, like cracks in dry earth. Grandma, I exhaled, and a lump rose in my throat. That word encapsulated my entire childhood. All the smells of cookies, dried mint, all the bedtime stories, all the scoldings. Come in, come in. You're just the same as you always were, Kapusha. Grandma stepped aside, letting me in. I see you didn't come back in peace. I said nothing, not having the strength to argue. Besides, as always, she was right. What peace could there be when everything had gone to ruin? I carried my shabby suitcase into the front room. The house smelled just like it did in my distant childhood. Wood resin, dried herbs, and something else. Something elusive, my old life, probably. The first few days passed in complete stupor. I slept for 12 hours, waking only to the shuffling of my grandmother's slippers on the floor as she slowly hobbled about, doing simple household chores. Of course, I helped with the housework, but silently, quite mechanically. I brought water, threw wood on the fire, cleared the snow. My grandmother didn't ask any questions. She knew everything without words, as always. Sometimes her heavy, piercing gaze would rest on me and I would look away, feeling not like a 30-year-old woman, but like a guilty girl. And then December 3rd came. The morning was gray and sunless. The frost nipped unpleasantly at my cheeks and chilled my skin. It was cold even inside the house. Grandma Krista, usually unhurried, was bustling about from dawn. "Today is a busy day," she announced at breakfast, breaking off a piece of white bread. "Busy and cursed. We have to finish everything before dark, so you'll have to help me." "What? What kind of work?" I asked wearily, looking lazily at my mug of steaming tea. "Holy work," she said emphatically, blinking her eyes, as if it were as obvious as the fact that snow is white. I suddenly felt like a complete fool for not knowing such simple things. Don't you remember? Today is the day when the earth is finally covered for the winter, and with it all kinds of underground evil spirits, devils and goblins hide in their burrows, in crevices and under thresholds. They are so afraid of the cold. But today is their last chance to do harm. With their last ounce of strength, they can turn around and cause trouble for people before their long hibernation. If they get into the house somewhere, they will torment us until spring. I looked at the old woman, not understanding. She spoke about it with the same practical seriousness with which she discussed salting cabbage. "What evil spirits, Bab. We live in the 21st century. There's the internet everywhere, new technologies, food delivery, and other benefits of civilization after all. And you're telling me about some kind of devils?" My voice took on the familiar urban irony. The old woman snorted, finishing her sandwiches made with bread and homemade butter. "Oh, you fool, you don't understand anything. You and I have different lives. Your life is running on asphalt and living in a concrete box. Mine is being friends with the earth and what's under it. There are different kinds of evil spirits. I'm not talking about the poltergeists they show on TV, but real demons that torment people and destroy their souls. I'm talking about evil spirits, for example, the Bannock, who lives in the bathhouse and can suffocate people. There are many of them. There's Jikari, Matocha, Abderika. There are many of these insidious creatures, and in order for them to let us live in peace, we have to try hard." I listened, and in my tired head these names bounced off like peas off a wall. Nonsense, pure nonsense. Rural superstition. But there was nothing fairy tale-like in the old woman's tone. There was cold, centuries-old caution. I had no doubt that the old woman really believed in all this. And what to do about it all? I couldn't help asking. Curse the evil spirits. Christina's voice became low and instructive, so that it would not come out of its underground darkness for a long time. The frosts chase them away, binding the earth. But they, the creatures, want heat, the living warmth of human anxiety. Now all the fever can crawl out. You need to charm and fumigate the house so they don't come in here. I have thistles dried, since summer especially for this, and we will fumigate. I listened, barely holding back a smile. It was like a scary fairy tale for children. The world of problems, betrayal, loans, loneliness seemed much more real than these folkloric horror stories. Seriously, I couldn't help but smile slightly at the spells. Grandma turned around sharply. Her gaze was so sharp that my smile instantly vanished from my face. "Don't be blasphemous, you city fool." She barked so loudly that I flinched. "If you don't value your life, at least be polite. People have adhered to this for centuries. Respect other people's beliefs." I immediately fell silent and decided to back down. It's better not to argue with her, or she'll hit me on the head. "Come on, Grandma, what's the matter with you? If we need to talk, then we will. And anyway, why don't I remember this? According to you, you perform these rituals every year. Because I never trusted you with this. I did everything myself early in the morning while you were still asleep. There's no point in confusing a child with such things. And now you're here. You'll help." Grandma assigned the work herself. But her rheumatism, aggravated by the dampness, had stiffened her knees. So all the fun fell to me. And Grandma sat on the couch, wrapped in a shawl, and directed us like a commander from headquarters. "Inga, listen here. First, the stovepipe. Come here and read the spell I wrote for you on a piece of paper. Then all the windows, the frames on the house side crosswise, smear them with juniper oil. Then all 3 thresholds, and the last door. And after the spell, fill everything with smoke from a smoldering thistle branch over water. It is important that there are no gaps left anywhere. Not a single one. Be sure to go to the barn where the cattle are. And check the chicken coop. The animals need to be taken care of too. Yes, don't forget about the bathhouse, you understand? Don't mess anything up. Otherwise, you'll have to pay dearly for your mistakes." I took a yellow sheet of paper from my school notebook. Crooked, shaky letters formed strange phrases. Then I felt completely awkward and ridiculous. Read this nonsense aloud? In an empty house? But my grandmother's gaze was serious. I had to do it. I muttered the words of the spell, holding thistles in my hands, which emitted acrid, bitter smoke. I followed Baba Krista's instructions. I traced the smoke around the door frames, window frames, and the hole in the chimney. I blessed the corners, whispering meaningless words like a parrot. Inside, everything was rebelling. I, Inga, a woman with a higher education, who had gone through the hell of corporate wars and court proceedings, was practicing shamanism. No one would believe me if I told them. When it came to the attic and the cold basement, something inside me broke. My legs were aching from fatigue, my throat was sore from the smoke, and my grandmother, curled up on the couch, was already dozing off, nodding her head. I won't hide it, I decided to slack off. The thistle in the basin had burned out, so I poured the ashes outside the door, lazily waved my hand around the front door, muttering something like, "Get away from me." I didn't go up to the attic. The stairs were steep and rickety. So was the underground passage. It was dark and scary there, and it smelled of earth and mold. I didn't go to the bread and chicken coop either, too lazy to trudge through the snow. So what, I thought, making myself a strong cup of tea. Nothing will happen, the old woman believes it, so let her, I'm not a child. Grandma woke up just before evening. She did everything, all the corners, all the cracks. Of course, Grandma, I replied, looking her straight in the eye. She studied me with a long, intense gaze, then nodded. Well, thank God. Now the main thing is not to go anywhere after sunset, not to open the windows, not to answer the door no matter who knocks, even if it's my voice calling me. It all started with little things. Night fell early, a thick winter night. The wind died down, and there was such silence that my ears rang. We went to bed early, my grandmother in her bedroom and I in mine. I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. My whole body ached from the unfamiliar physical work, and my brain, unaccustomed to silence, was feverishly awake. And then I heard the first sound, a creak. One single, clear, like a click. It came from right under the bed. I froze, listening. Silence. An old house. It spoke for itself. The logs were probably drying out, but the sound repeated itself. Again and again. Not chaotic, but rhythmic. A creak. Pause. Creak. Pause. As if someone were swinging on a swing under the floor, in the underground space that I hadn't fumigated. My heart began to beat faster. Fighting the trembling in my fingers, I turned on my phone. I shone the light under the bed. Nothing but dusty floor beams. But the creaking had stopped. Nerves. Just nerves. I had just begun to doze off when I sensed that something in the air had changed. A strange smell appeared. Not sharp, but barely perceptible. The smell of damp sheep's wool, dry earth, and a strange sourness. Something was moving in the darkness, restlessly and convulsively. Then I heard a quiet, wet sound, like someone's lips. I froze again, listening. Then I slowly turned around from the gap between the squat stool and the huge, whitewashed stove. Two eyes were staring at me, dark, deep sockets with no whites, only a glint, like an insect's, and around them, wrinkled, damp, dark gray skin. My fingers went cold. The house stood black and silent. No movement. Maybe it was all in my imagination. Maybe it was a rat, a huge old rat, and the shadows played a cruel joke. I gasped in fear. I pulled the blanket over my head and closed my eyes, trying to fall asleep, but sleep came, heavy and broken. In the morning, the old woman limped into the hayloft to get some firewood. Suddenly, she screamed. I jumped up. The old woman was standing next to her old fur coat, which was hanging on a nail. From the hem of the coat to the floor, there was a long, straight crack, as if it had been cut with a sharp knife. But the edges of the cut were not ragged, but stuck together, dried out, as if the skin had been torn. "Abgaricha," whispered the grandmother, turning pale. She was in the hallway. "Inga, did you fumigate the threshold in the hallway?" I remembered. There was a small, almost invisible crack under the door. It had caught fire. Of course, I waved my hand at it. "I think so." I lied uncertainly. Grandma looked at me with a long, searching gaze. She said nothing. The second act took place in the evening. I decided to wash myself and heated up the bathhouse in the yard. The bathhouse was warm and fragrant, but as soon as I went inside and closed the door, earth began to fall from the top shelf in the darkest corner. A handful of cold, damp earth fell right on my head. The air suddenly became stifling, unbearably hot. The stone, which had just gone out, glowed red again, emitting threatening hisses. I screamed in fear and ran out into the frost, wearing only a towel. A cloud of steam burst out of the bathhouse behind me, taking on the shape of a clumsy, broad-shouldered figure. Babarist immediately understood everything. "You silly girl," the old woman said bitterly. "I told you not to leave a single crack open." The bath attendant crossed the threshold. "Now we won't be able to get rid of him until spring. He'll cause trouble." On the third day, the food disappeared. The fresh milk in a large iron pot soured within an hour. The bread was covered with blue poisonous mold. Every night brought only fear to this house. As soon as the last ray of sunlight disappeared behind the forest, everything in the house began to stir. Claws scraped against the wall in the hallway, leaving long, wet streaks. Something hissed and jumped behind the stove, as if some creature were dancing on the hot coals. The dishes in the cupboard clattered on their own, and cups fell one after another, shattering with a heart-rending crash. And then came the restless dreams. I dreamed that I was drowning in a well, ice under my feet, black, incredibly cold water full of kin. I woke up screaming in a cold sweat. Then I dreamed that I was buried alive. The earth fell on my face, filling my mouth and nose. I desperately tried to dig myself out, but my fingers hit the coffin lid. Now I could no longer deny it. What was happening was beyond logic, beyond my urban understanding of the world. It was a village, a dark mechanism against which there were no antidepressants or psychotherapists. It was a war declared on me for my contempt, for my arrogance, for daring to consider these rules nonsense. Grandma fought desperately against it. She smoked the whole hut with incense, mercilessly burned church candles, prayed. Together we dragged ourselves to church, even invited the priest. It didn't help. One frosty morning, my grandmother went to feed her goats, cow, ducks, and other animals while I cleared the freshly fallen snow. Suddenly, I heard a piercing scream from the barn. Everything inside went cold. My grandmother rushed out with her eyes wide with fear. She stopped in the middle of the yard, pale as the snow, gasping for air with her toothless mouth wide open. "Inga, granddaughter," she whispered helplessly. "Grandma, what happened? Are you sick?" I rushed to her, shoveling away the snowdrifts. I grabbed the old woman by her thin shoulders and began to examine her frantically, trying to understand what had happened to her. Maybe an ambulance? There, in the barn, my grandmother whispered hoarsely. I rushed there immediately. Bursting into the small building, I saw something that made me scream and recoil. I even tripped over the wooden threshold and fell heavily backward into the snow. 3 carcasses hung from the ceiling. 1 large one, a cow, and 2 smaller ones, goats. Someone had mercifully and precisely cut their throats. Hot blood spurted from the cuts, mixing with hay and pungent-smelling feces. The animal's eyes, bulging with tension, first rolled wildly, then began to freeze. The air in their lungs was running out. The animals bellowed blood, blowing crimson viscous bubbles from their wide nostrils. The last painful moans escaped from their bloodied lips. They had just been slaughtered literally before Grandma's arrival. The perpetrator knew perfectly well that she would come here. This spectacle was staged especially for her. The cow and goat were tied to thick ceiling beams with rusty chains. The Grandma used to walk them in the summer. That was the last straw. When the shock wore off, the carcasses were removed and given to the neighbors for a symbolic price. Yasso, after all. It was a shame to just leave it here. And then I almost, forcibly dragged my grandmother to pack her things. As her only relative, I decided that we would not stay in this house for another second. We gathered everything we needed, loaded it into Vlad's car, and left before dark. Baba Hristi rebelled, resisted, didn't want to leave her native walls. But I was adamant. We would spend the winter in a safe city, and in the spring, when the snow melted, we would return. In the car, we had a conversation that had been bothering me since the first strange things started happening. Dad, tell me, why don't all these demons, ghouls, and banshees bother people in the city? Why did people live and continue to live peacefully there, in the concrete jungle? Have they never even heard of these creatures? I asked, gripping the steering wheel. At first, Christina Fedosevna was silent for a long time. Either she was still angry, or she was thinking about her answer. But after a couple of minutes, she sighed and began to explain. Because it depends primarily on the people themselves. People today are not very literate, especially those who live in the city. They don't know anything about faith. And how, in essence, can you approach those who don't believe? And there's no shit or baths in the apartments. Where would the bathhouse come from? Young people are a different generation. You have your own traditions. You believe in other things. We were raised differently. We old people all believe we are afraid. That's why evil spirits